This episode is brought to you by, well, you. Thanks to our new Patreon subscribers, Laura Kitchings, Karen Cox, and Michael Haddam for helping to make this show possible. If you'd like to support Historians at the Movies podcast, you can visit patreon.com/historians at the movies. Now time for the show. Hey everybody, this is Jason Herbert, and welcome back to Historians at the Movies podcast, where every single week we're talking about movies and the histories behind them. And this week, we're not talking about a movie at all. We're actually talking about the history, the life of Nicolas Cage, maybe the guy who is responsible for all of these things. You guys all know that HATM started by watching National Treasure 6 years ago. So today, we brought on Zach Schonfeld. He just wrote a brand new book called How Coppola Became Cage. It's all about how Nicolas Cage started into Hollywood, his early career. And Zach and I have the absolute most amazing conversation talking about this guy who has had the most amazing career. We talk about his early life and all the way up until now, talking about our favorite films, his early dalliances with Hollywood, and all of the things around his life. So this is a fun conversation. It's a little bit different than we've ever done before. We're just talking about an actor today, maybe the actor for HATM. So I hope you enjoyed this pod. It was a lot of fun to record. Sit back and relax, because How Coppola Became Cage is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. Zach, how are you, man?
I'm good.
Dude, okay, I owe you an apology because we started talking about doing this pod months ago, and then HATM took off, and then I moved here, and I was trying to get everything set up over here, and everything got pushed to the back burner. And then you were like, "Hey, do you still want to do this?" Absolutely, because this book is so freaking cool. I've been reading it recently, and I have I pulled it off the shelf before I start getting ready for this pod.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of this career, I don't know how familiar you are with HATM and all the stuff about how we're built around National Treasure was how this thing kicked off 6 years ago. But he's part of my life now, so I feel like it's time we had an episode devoted only to him.
Yeah, and it's fitting that the podcast was spawned by National Treasure, because that was one of the first Cage movies I ever saw. That was kind of the beginning of my Cage fandom, was going to see National Treasure. I think I was in 8th grade, and that movie had a big effect on me. Really got me excited about history and about Nicolas Cage and about the idea of finding a treasure map on the back of the Declaration of Independence.
Oh my gosh, yes. It's okay. I should tell you. First of all, I applaud you because you wrote about this in the book about your mom took you to see the film. And all I could think when I was reading was I'm so glad that Zach's mom brought him to see National Treasure instead of Leaving Las Vegas as your first Nicolas Cage film. I was like, what a different story. How different Zach would have been growing up had that been the first film you saw. Dude, we have so much to talk about with this dude. I was talking about him at work today. I was telling people you and I were gonna talk, and how excited I was about this. And I was like, is Nicolas Cage the most enigmatic actor in Hollywood? When you look at the scope of work, the breadth of himself as an artist, and his inability to turn down any role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's we'll get into this, but he's a fascinating dude.
And he's had so many lives. I mean, his career is 40 years long now, and he's gone through so many phases, and he's gone through so many career downturns and then subsequent comebacks. It's kind of remarkable that he's still out there doing his thing.
Yeah, and there appears to be no slowing down, because just when you're ready to write him off, he'll come back, right? And then it's he'll either do something really big, or he'll do this incredibly artistic thing like Pig or something like that, and it's crazy what the guy can do.
And it feels like he's been in one such comeback cycle recently with Pig and with Dream Scenario, and now this new movie Long Legs that he has.
Before we start talking about Nick Cage, let's talk about you. Actually, you want to introduce yourself and what you're doing here and so forth?
Sure. I am a journalist who specializes in writing about pop culture, particularly film, music, internet culture, etc. Um, I was a senior writer at Newsweek. I worked at Newsweek for 5 years. I got laid off from Newsweek in 2019 and kind of pivoted to the freelance lifestyle since then. Um, these days, I write for a variety of different publications. My most frequent clients are Pitchfork, Vulture, Spin, The Guardian, and yeah, I've been fascinated by Nicolas Cage for many years. I mentioned that National Treasure was kind of the movie that sparked my interest. So it's been a long time coming. The book, this is my second book. It's called How Coppola Became Cage. Just came out about 6 months ago. And yes, the book is um, kind of it's kind of a deep dive into the early years and the origin story of the actor known as Nicolas Cage. Covers his career up to and including leaving Las Vegas, and it ends with him winning the Academy Award for leaving Las Vegas. And I argue that that's basically the culmination of the first phase of his career.
Yeah, when you and I were talking about this, we were like, you're like, yeah, I wrote this book about the early career for Nick Cage, right? I was like, oh, okay, cool. This movie like goes up to like 85, 87 or something like that. And then I realized, wait a second, this guy's been acting for 40 some odd years. Early career doesn't begin to encapsulate. What is it? Leaving Las Vegas comes out, what, 90? Was it
95.
It's almost 30 years ago, and the guy's still rocking and rolling. And he's continued on to make all kinds of stuff, from like really interesting stuff, frankly, to schlock to like, everything else in between. And like, I pulled off like a list of all those films. And I was like, when I sent you this email, I was like, hey, can you pick out 5 movies that describe him? I don't know this can be possible for us to do that because he's been in so much stuff.
Yeah, it's tough. You want to hear my 5?
No, let's wait. Let's make
Okay.
the audience wait on this because I
Okay.
feel like there should be some savory here. For people who are coming to HATM, and I actually want to ask you quite a bit about your freelance writing as well, especially because so many scholars have like these. We get a lot of historians who listen in on this stuff, and people are just generally interested in history. So I actually want to talk to you about like writing for larger audiences too. But yeah, so much of this hinges on the idea of this Nicolas Coppola, who becomes Nick Cage, right?
Yeah.
And as I was reading your book and thinking about him, and of course, I think the ties to him and the superhero stuff are well established. He takes his name from Luke Cage, as you were talking about. We know about his son. We know about the Tim Burton Superman stuff. It feels, Zach, like, is this guy living does he have is he living an alternate life? Is there a different identity? Is like Nicolas Cage, the Superman to Nicolas Coppola's Clark Kent? I mean, who is this guy?
There is definitely a superhero element to his origin story. He took the name Cage from Luke Cage. So he grew up reading Marvel comic books and named himself after Luke Cage, who I think was the first black Marvel superhero. And he had a lot of angst about being a Coppola and kind of living and brooding in the shadow of his uncle's success. His uncle being Francis Ford Coppola, who during Cage's childhood became one of the most celebrated and successful American filmmakers on the strength of the Godfather movies. And Cage, when he started going to auditions and he set out to prove himself as an actor, he was very frustrated by the baggage that he was carrying because people only thought of him as Francis Ford Coppola's nephew. And he would go to auditions and, the casting director only wanted to talk about, Apocalypse Now or like, what's it like to be Francis's nephew? And Cage, he felt very he felt very boxed in and felt like he was struggling to establish an identity for himself. And so he changed his name, and he was desperate to prove that he could make it on his own. And yeah, I think, you know, he had he had a lot of angst and resentment, and I think there's something superhero like about the way that he gave himself a new name, and along with that new name came this like almost Superman like confidence, which he channeled into Valley Girl, which was his first leading role. Um, and you know, later movies like when he did Birdie and Peggy Sue Got Married, he was really able to carve out an identity for himself only once he had shed the Coppola name and established an identity that was wholly his own.
And I think a lot of audiences come to Cage not even knowing, in a lot of ways, his connections to Francis Ford Coppola, Talia Shire, that family, which is, when you look at Jason Schwartzman, right? You look at all the people involved in that family. It's almost dynastic in quality when you look at the films that they've been involved in, especially once you add him into that mix, right? I mean, they are
But
powerhouses.
here's the thing that's interesting is that Cage wasn't born rich, and his parents weren't wealthy because his dad, August Coppola, was a literary professor, kind of an eccentric, very eccentric literature professor who, by all accounts, was a brilliant man, but emotionally distant and not the most present father figure. And Cage's mom, her name was Joy Vogelsang. His mother was she suffered from mental illness throughout much of his childhood, and so she was institutionalized for a number of years. So his dad was kind of more or less a single parent to three sons, and part of why Cage was so eager to separate himself or to change his name from Coppola is because he was very frustrated that people assumed that he had some privileged upper class upbringing, which wasn't really the case. His dad was living on a professor's salary. His mom was in a mental institution, and he didn't grow up with the kind of wealth and extravagant lifestyle that his Coppola cousins did. And when there's a story in my book about how when Cage was about 13 or 14, his dad went off on some sort of sabbatical and sent Cage to live with his uncle Francis for a year. And so Cage was living at his uncle's, very extravagant home in San Francisco. And Cage was kind of stewing with jealousy and resentment because his cousins had access to this incredibly fancy lifestyle, and they had a movie theater in their basement, and Cage wanted to earn that kind of success for himself on his own terms.
Was there anything with Cage, or I guess with Nicolas Coppola as he's growing up? Is there ever anything that he has a chance of going up to be? One of the things you talk about is like these missed opportunities. We'll get into this in a bit about some of these almost Nicolas Cage being and stuff like that. Was there ever a world in which Nicolas Cage does not become Nicolas Cage, where he just goes off to become like a professor or an artist or something like that? Or was he always kind of destined to go into Hollywood, into being a film, into being a film star? I mean,
his dad wanted him to become a professor. His dad wanted him to be a writer or academic. And part of one source of discord between Cage and his father is that he wanted to be an actor and his dad disapproved. But Cage often talks about how the life-changing epiphany for him as a kid was when he saw East of Eden, and he watched James Dean's performance in East of Eden, and he was so moved by it, and so incredibly struck by James Dean that that was a moment when he knew he needed to be an actor. Like he wanted to be James Dean. He wanted to make audiences feel and cry and experience the full range of emotion that James Dean was able to channel. I think, I also interviewed Cage's brother, Christopher Coppola, for the book, and Christopher Coppola talked to me about how when they were boys, they would shoot these like Super 8 amateur movies in their backyard, and Chris was the director, and his brother Nick was always the star of these Super 8 movies. So I think he was born to be an actor. I think he always had that. There was something in him that needed to perform for the camera since he was a child. He acted in plays at Beverly Hills High. He was in Oklahoma. I believe he starred in a Beverly Hills High production of The Crucible. But is there a world in which he never made it big? Yeah, I think so. I mean, his big break was Valley Girl, which was the first audition that he went to after he had changed his name. And, Cage has talked about how, for some reason, like changing his name and shedding the Coppola part of his name gave him the confidence to perform at that audition and to channel something with that like weight removed from his shoulders. But the director of Valley Girl, Martha Coolidge, she did not know that he was a Coppola, which is obviously what he wanted. And she had to talk the studio into letting her cast him in the movie because I think they were somewhat skeptical of his abilities or his looks. And, he hadn't really been in much by that point. If he had not landed the role in Valley Girl, would his career ever have taken off? I don't know. That was his big break. But on the other hand, there's this contradiction. There's this contradiction in Cage's story where he simultaneously was trying to strike out on his own and trying to distance himself from the Coppola family. But at the same time, he was also willing to accept roles in his Uncle Francis's movies. Francis gave him a role in Rumblefish, which was one of his very first film roles. And then later on, he was in The Cotton Club and Peggy Sue Got Married, both directed by Francis Ford Coppola. So, it's like he didn't want people to know that he was a Coppola, and he didn't want people to accuse him of benefiting from nepotism. But, of course he did benefit from nepotism by landing roles in Francis Ford Coppola's films.
Yeah. Okay. So there's been, I know this. There's been all this discourse recently about Nepo babies and things like that in Hollywood and so forth. I gotta tell you, Zach, I've always had an issue with the idea. I mean, people want to see who they want to see on screen. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have the abilities, you're simply not going to do well. I mean, I'm sure that there are numbers of failed actors and and children of actors and directors and producers who have just not made it on screen. And I don't find it, I don't know, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Because, we talk about the idea that his father wanted him to go off and become a professor, become an academic. And so many of my friends in the history world are sons or daughters of other professors and historians and things like that, right? Are we surprised that this guy would want to go, especially when you've got a family like, when your uncle made arguably the two best films ever made? Mm-hmm. Is it a surprise that he would want to do this? I mean,
no,
I can't
it's
see
not.
It.
I mean, he grew up, watching his uncle's career take off. I mean, Cage was 8 years old when The Godfather came out, and he talks about how his dad wouldn't let him see The Godfather when it came out, and then like at some point he was able to see it, and he was very he was kind of turned on by the scene where Al Pacino is kissing the Sicilian bride. But and then a few years later, Francis went off to the Philippines and brought his kids with him to make Apocalypse Now, which turned into like a 3-year ordeal of shooting in the jungle. And apparently Francis wanted Nick and his older brother Christopher to like go off and leave school and like go off to the Philippines and watch them shoot Apocalypse Now. And Cage's father was like, absolutely not, like, they're in school. So there was definitely a lot of family tension between Cage's dad, August Coppola, and Cage's uncle, Francis Coppola, because Cage's dad was resentful of the fact that all of a sudden the Coppola family, Francis kind of swallowed up all of the oxygen in the Coppola family, and the Coppolas became a Hollywood dynasty, whereas August Coppola had, he had built this career for himself in academia, and his accomplishments were suddenly overshadowed by his younger brother Francis, and that caused a good deal of resentment and strife. And then when Cage was like 13 or 14, he got to attend an early screening of Apocalypse Now at his uncle's house up in San Francisco, and he met Dennis Hopper there. And then I believe he was sometimes on set when Francis was shooting One from the Heart, which was shot on the Zoetrope soundstage. And so Cage had like a front row seat to Francis Ford Coppola's career during some of the most interesting and also the most fraught years of Francis's career, when his fortunes suddenly changed, after One from the Heart flopped at the box office. But it makes sense that Cage wanted to become an actor and felt this need to prove himself. He kind of grew up in this very complicated, very high profile Hollywood family, watching his uncle achieve enormous success and riches, during the new Hollywood boom era of the 1970s. And then he watched his uncle's fortunes, suddenly change overnight when One from the Heart came out.
We talk about, Francis Ford Coppola cast him in a couple of movies early on. Was there always like a guiding force behind that, or it was like, hey, I'll help you out, kid, and then you're on your own, or what happened?
So this is complicated. The relationship between Nick and his uncle is a complex thing, and Nick, as I mentioned, he had this like weird chip on his shoulder, this weird resentment of his uncle's success, and this need to prove himself on his own. And yet he still very eagerly wanted to act in his uncle's movies because he knew that would be a huge boost to his career. So around 1982, Cage was 18, and he was the perfect age to star in The Outsiders, which was the movie that Francis was casting. The movie that would kind of help restore his career and his finances after the One from the Heart debacle. So Cage, along with every young rising star of his generation, auditioned for The Outsiders, and so he's there auditioning with like a young Tom Cruise and Emilio Estevez and the whole Brat Pack, and Cage was rejected. And he was very upset that he didn't get a role in his uncle's movie. His uncle rejected him. And so Francis went off to Oklahoma to shoot The Outsiders. And during The Outsiders shoot, Francis read another novel by S.E. Hinton, Rumblefish, and decided to adapt that book as well. So he wound up shooting The Outsiders and Rumblefish back to back in Tulsa, using much of the same crew and, a lot of overlap between the casts of those two movies. And so Francis and his producer / casting guru, Fred Roos, they kind of played a trick on Cage. So they told Cage that they were casting for their next movie, Rumblefish, and they wanted Cage to come to the like Zoetrope lot and read the actors who were auditioning. Basically, like read, the other part of the script. But they didn't tell Cage that it was an audition. They just told him like, hey, we need your help. We want you to read the actors who are auditioning. So Cage didn't think that he was auditioning. He thought he was just kind of helping out and, facilitating. So Cage helped audition the actors who were auditioning for Rumblefish. And the next day he got a call from, someone at Zoetrope, and they said, okay, we want to give you a part in Rumblefish. You got the part of Smokey. I think it's Smokey is his character's
Smokey,
name. Yeah, Smokey.
Yeah.
And so that was a big break for Cage. And he was very confused because he didn't know that he was auditioning for Rumblefish. They surprised him by giving him a role. And Fred Roos, who was Francis's producer, right-hand man, I interviewed Fred Roos for the book, and Fred Roos told me that he was the one who was kind of pushing Francis to give Nick a role. Fred had seen, I guess he saw one of Cage's student films or something, and he said to Francis, Nick, you gotta check out what Nicky's doing. He's a good actor. And Francis was like, Nicky acting? Really? Francis, I think, was surprised or taken aback that his nephew was actually a talented actor. So Fred Roos, I believe, persuaded Francis to give Cage a role in Rumblefish, and it's a significant role. Not a lead role, but it's a supporting role. And so Cage ended up shooting Rumblefish and Valley Girl back to back in '82. Both movies came out in '83, and that became his his big break. '83 was the year that Cage, that was the year that put him on the map. And then after Valley Girl came out, I think Francis was really impressed and realized that Cage had a lot of talent. And Francis offered Cage a role in his next film, which turned out to be The Cotton Club, which was its own, kind of ordeal.
I don't think about Cotton Club whenever I think about Francis Ford Coppola.
Most people don't.
Right. We've done it on HATM. We watched it one night.
Oh, yeah?
Fascinated with that era. Yeah, absolutely. And like a lot of the films, it's beautiful to watch. At the same time, when we talk about it, I go, I can't remember anything about it.
That movie has the ingredients of a masterpiece. It should be a masterpiece. It's an amazing cast, one of the greatest directors of all time, such a rich, juicy, historically substantial story. And yet there's just something, it's less than the sum of its parts, I think.
Thank you for saying that. You're absolutely right.
Well, the other thing is that The Cotton Club is a complicated movie in the context of Nicolas Cage. The character who he plays in The Cotton Club is certainly one of the most, homicidal and vicious characters that Cage has ever played. He plays this vicious, very violent gangster type of guy, based on a real 1930s gangster. I think Mad Dog something is Vince Mad Dog Dwyer.
Vince Dwyer, yeah.
Vince Dwyer is the character's name. And so Cage was 19, and he was, so at this time he was very close with Sean Penn. He had become friends with Sean Penn, and Sean Penn was trying to be the ultimate method actor. Sean Penn would stay in character for weeks on end when he was shooting a movie, and he would, force everyone on set to call him by his character's name. He would never break character. And it was kind of, it was really extreme. And so Cage tried to emulate what Sean Penn was doing. He decided, I'm going to, stay in character and just fully commit to this role. And so during the Cotton Club shoot, Cage was trying to remain in character as this violent, horrible gangster. And he was walking around the set behaving like a maniac because he was trying to behave the way his character would behave. And his character is, a murderer. So at one point, he trashed his trailer. He destroyed his trailer because he was trying to channel, the violent energy of the character he was playing. There's a story in my book about how Cage, he's playing a racist character. It's the 1930s. Prohibition era movie, and his character uses the N-word numerous times in the film. So Cage started using the N-word on set, and he almost got into a fist fight with a black extra on the set of The Cotton Club because the guy was so upset by hearing Cage, throwing around racial slurs. So Cage was acting like a lunatic, and he admitted a couple of years after the fact that the way he was behaving was so out of control. He said something like in an interview, Cage said, "I was trying to stay in character in the Cotton Club, but I could only do it for a week or two because if I had stayed in character that whole shoot, I'd be in prison by now."
Well, it's also he's 19, right? I don't think anybody considers as an adult, and he's trying to do very adult things, right?
Yeah.
I'm a gangster now. I'm in a real Hollywood movie directed by the god of filmmaking at this point in time, and it's when I remember watching it when we did it on HATM, thinking he wasn't good in that movie. I kept thinking he was miscast at the time.
Mm-hmm.
He was just it's like I'm watching a baby. Mm-hmm. in this world. And of course, look, a lot of these gangster guys are young dudes who, but it just cut from a different cloth. They felt harder than Cage was. Of course, as an actor, he's going to mature.
I think he has his moments in that film, but it's not his best work. And the film, it's an ensemble piece, but none of the performances really none of the performances in that film really, I think, get the kind of screen time or narrative arc that feels satisfying. And that Cage's behavior on set, there's one Zoetrope employee who I interviewed who worked with him on the Cotton Club said that he thought he could get away with that behavior because it was his uncle directing, but it was like watching a teenage boy acting out in front of his parents. And he was a teenage boy, literally. But that was kind of the movie, I think, where Cage learned that you can't stay in character 24/7, or else you'll lose your mind or wind up in jail.
Heath Ledger's a great example of that, right? I got questions for you. Actually, I want to come back because we're about to hit like this amazing run that he makes in the mid '80s, and his career seems to be full of these like runs of like 3-year runs where he just erupts, right?
Yeah.
And then he falls back up. But before we get into that, because I'm leading towards Moonstruck and Peggy Sue Got Married and Raising Arizona, obviously, but I'm wondering, you're talking about his relationship with Sean Penn, and he's the same age as all these guys in The Outsiders, the same age. Right now they're revisiting the Brat Pack on television, things like that. And I'm kind of wondering, does Cage get sucked into this, or does he avoid this? Like, who is he running with at this point in time in his life? Is he able to is he getting mixed up in the Hollywood crowd? What's going on with him?
So, he wasn't he's the same age as all those Brat Pack actors, right, but he never really fit into that mold. And I think part of the problem was that he looked older than he was. And so, after Valley Girl and Racing with the Moon and Birdie, he quickly looked too old to be playing, teenage, high school type roles. And Cage said that he met John Hughes. I think he may have auditioned for The Breakfast Club, and John Hughes said something to him like, "You look like you're 35," and Cage was only like 20 at that time. So he looked older than he was, and so he, by the time he did Moonstruck, he's 23 years old and he's playing Cher's lover, and she's 40, and he doesn't, it doesn't look weird. It doesn't look like there's an age gap between them, even though there's a huge age gap. So he never quite fit into the Brat Pack mold. He something about Cage, he didn't fit into, the John Hughes high school movies. He was a little too wacky, a little too dark or eccentric. In terms of who is he running with, he was very tight with Sean Penn, as I mentioned. They did a movie together called Racing with the Moon, which is a World War II period piece where they played best friends in the 1940s, and they kind of became best friends over the course of shooting that film. Cage was also pretty tight with Johnny Depp in this era, and you may have heard that Cage actually introduced Johnny Depp to Cage's agent, who soon became Johnny Depp's agent, and Johnny Depp credits Cage with launching his career and introducing him to his agent. And Cage was also close with Jim Carrey. They became tight because they were in Peggy Sue Got Married, which was one of Jim Carrey's very first film roles. Cage and Carrey were both troublemakers. They both had a real appetite for causing mischief. And in fact, they got into some pranks on the set of Peggy Sue Got Married that almost got them thrown off the film. There's a story in my book about how at one point at their hotel, they held up a room service waiter with a prop gun, and they pretended it was a real gun. And they got in a lot of trouble for like scaring the shit out of this poor like hotel room service waiter. Cage and Carrey, they became very tight. They were drinking buddies, and they remained tight for a number of years to the point that Jim Carrey wanted Nicolas Cage to co-star with him in Dumb and Dumber, and Cage was one of the actors who was on the short list to play the Jeff Daniels role in Dumb and Dumber.
Wow!
So that's a real alternate history right there. Like how would his career be different if he had taken Dumb and Dumber? And would he have been able to pull off that role? I don't know.
Jeff Daniels is special, man.
Yeah. Cage also, he dated a lot of actresses in the 80s. He dated Jenny Wright. She never really made it big, but she was his girlfriend for a number of years. And he also dated and had a child with Christina Fulton. She is the mother of his first son, and Cage fell in love with Patricia Arquette, who he met at Cantor's Deli in LA when she was like 18, and many years later, they got married. So yeah, he had a pretty colorful social life and romantic life during this period.
We see 86, 87 are just a murderer's row of films for him. I've got Boy in Blue but Peggy Sue Got Married, which we talked about, Raising Arizona, which may be a lot of people's favorite film by him, and then Moonstruck, which was probably how I came to be aware of Cage, and he kind of morphs into a star at this point in time, does he not?
Yeah, so 1983 was his breakout year, the year that put him on the map. But 1987 was the year that solidified his stardom and turned him into a household name. Raising Arizona, incredible film. I think that's his greatest pure comical performance. I mean, he channels this cartoonish energy in that movie. His performance was very much inspired by Looney Tunes and Woody Woodpecker, and it's just that movie is one of my absolute favorites by Cage. And then right after Raising Arizona, he landed the Moonstruck, the lead role in Moonstruck, which was a role which he almost did not get, but Cher was insistent that she wanted Nicolas Cage to be her co-star in Moonstruck, and the studio didn't like him. Studio didn't think that he was a star, and Cher basically threatened to pull out of the movie if they didn't let Cage have the role. So she really went to bat for him. Moonstruck was a movie which Cage only reluctantly agreed to star in Moonstruck. His agent kind of forced him to do it. He thought it was too cheesy. He didn't want to be doing romantic comedies. He wanted to be doing darker, more experimental films like Vampire's Kiss. But his agent kind of talked him into doing Moonstruck. And Moonstruck came out at the end of 87, I think December of 1987, and became an instant success and garnered a number of Academy Award nominations. Obviously, Cher won the Oscar for Best Actress, and Olivia
She's good at that.
Yeah, and Olympia Dukakis won an Oscar for Moonstruck as well, and it made a lot of money at the box office. And that movie really transformed Cage's career overnight and made him into a sex symbol, because he is very sexy in Moonstruck. He really he has a lot of chemistry with Cher, and that scene of him in the bakery when he's sweating and shoveling bread into the ovens, and he does that whole speech about I lost my hand, I lost my bride. I think that was a lot of viewers' introduction to Nicolas Cage. That that was kind of the scene that introduced American audiences to this rising star. What's interesting about Moonstruck is that on one hand, it was by far the most successful movie that Cage did in the 80s, both in terms of critical acclaim and in terms of box office success.
Mm-hmm.
But almost as soon as that film came out, he tried to run as far away from it as he possibly could. Like he really didn't want to do anything like it again. He wanted to do the opposite of Moonstruck. He wanted to do like really dark and violent and depraved movies like Vampire's Kiss and Wild at Heart.
It's almost like he was afraid of getting pigeonholed as romantic lead, things like that. The thing that Cher had to go fight for him to be anyway, because I never saw Cage as this particularly handsome guy. It's more his charisma or his I don't know, something about the guy has an appeal. And you're talking about how he departs from Moonstruck, which gets us actually to the very first film I ever actually saw him in, Firebirds, with Tommy Lee Jones. Oh yeah, Sean Young. Do you remember this film? It's oh my gosh.
Yeah. That was a real misfire for Cage. And it's interesting because that's the first action movie he ever did. And it just flopped. It's just, the movie was panned by critics. It didn't do well at the box office. It's kind of
it. The film, yeah.
It's not a good movie at all. No, he doesn't. Yeah, everything about it. It just feels like a Top Gun ripoff with a lot of military propaganda. And one thing that's interesting about Firebirds is that he admitted, even at the time, he admitted that he did that movie for the money, because
sure,
I think in around 1989 he bought his first like big house in Hollywood. He bought a mansion in the Hollywood Hills, and right after he bought that house, he did Firebirds because he needed to pay off. I guess he was kind of in over his head with the mortgage. And when Firebirds came out, Firebirds and Wild at Heart came out around the same time in the summer of 1990. And so he was doing all this press for Wild at Heart, but he didn't want to talk about Firebirds. And even though the movie had just come out, he like almost immediately distanced himself from Firebirds. And he admitted at the time to interviewers, like, oh yeah, like, I took, I was in over my head. I bought this house and I took that movie because the money was good and I needed to pay for the house. So he kind of admitted that he did the movie for the money, which is some real dramatic foreshadowing because, obviously I think it's common knowledge at this point that more recently in the 2010s, he was pumping out all these straight to VOD movies because of his financial woes. But I make the case in my book that he was, he occasionally did movies because of financial woes as early as 1990, way before that became, the driving force of his career was trying to pay off all this real estate debt.
It's there are a couple of different things I'm thinking here. One is like the story about Nicolas Cage as a working actor. Right? Mm-hmm. This idea is just trying to get in wherever he can. Doesn't want to be a Nepo baby, but absolutely, if Coppola will put him in a film, who's going to say no to that? I'm not, absolutely not. Right? I'm a realist. At the same time, he's, the law, we all know about his stories with money and stuff like that. He just keeps putting these movies out. Now it's just like, it's almost as though now whenever he puts out these prestige films, it's almost a surprise because of the amount of work that you want a movie? Nicolas Cage has a movie for you. right now. I mean, the guy's putting out 3-4 films a year now.
Right. Right.
And then you talk about him being close to Johnny Depp, which is weird because his career and Depp's career seem to parallel one another in so many different ways. There are these incredible guys with these incredible ranges. And at the same time, they both had the money issues. They both had the extravagance and stuff like that. Ups and downs in careers. It just, when you said that he and Depp were close, I was like, oh, golly. Yeah, that seems to make so much sense.
Yeah, they were buddies. And Cage helped launch Johnny Depp's career very early on.
He's got a couple a couple films that he puts out as we kind of get towards 95. It Could Happen to You with him and was it Bridget Fonda? Was it that? It seems like he was always around, even though the films weren't huge hits.
He was very prolific in the early 90s, and it's a weird time for Cage's career because he was kind of bouncing around from genre to genre, and he hadn't really found a niche. It seemed like he wasn't exactly sure what he wanted to do. And during that period, he started doing these more lighthearted romantic comedy type movies. You know, it was like, his post Moonstruck ban on romantic comedies had ended, and he kind of started tiptoeing back into the mainstream. And he did 3 kind of mainstream comedy films: Honeymoon in Vegas, Guarding Tess, and It Could Happen to You, which he referred to as his Sunshine Trilogy, because these 3 movies, which he did kind of in quick succession, they were an attempt by Nicolas Cage to try to do something more lighthearted, more upbeat, more sunshiny. And his explanation at the time was he told interviewers that his grandma had said to him that she was tired of seeing him do all these like really dark, tormented roles, and she said, like, can't you do a nice movie that I can go see with my friends? And so he wanted to do a more family friendly movie that his grandma could enjoy. But again, I think money was kind of the unspoken factor here. It was, once again, I think he needed to make some money, so he started to do more mainstream movies. And it's weird because in these particular films, you could see that Cage was trying to play normal characters, which was kind of like the weirdest thing that Cage could possibly be at this point, was try to be normal. And especially in Guarding Tess and It Could Happen to You, he's playing these like very Tom Hanks-esque everyman, almost, very like average Joe type characters, very normal, relatable, everyman type of roles. And it wasn't a fit for him. I mean, it's like, here's Nicolas Cage, one of the most eccentric actors in Hollywood history, and he's trying to convince audiences that he's just like a normal, average Joe. But that's an interesting era for Cage. Because, I mean, to be honest with you, before I started working on this book, I hadn't seen those particular films. I hadn't seen any of those early 90s comedies that he did. And they really, I don't think those movies have left much of a cultural imprint. Like people don't bring up It Could Happen to You today very much. But when I was researching that era of his career, I was fascinated by, I was trying to figure out how to organize the book and like which movies I was going to focus on and which movies I, wouldn't have room to really cover. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, I could do a whole chapter about this weird kind of misbegotten experiment that Cage did in the early 90s when he was trying to prove to everyone that he could be just like Tom Hanks. And it didn't really work, but it's interesting that he tried that. And then once again, he also did a comedy called Trapped in Paradise around this time, which bad movie, just like a really, really lackluster, crime comedy set around the holidays, kind of almost like an attempt to channel the Home Alone audience, but terrible movie. But Cage was doing all these mainstream comedies, and he was, I guess, trying to be a Tom Hanks type of actor, and it wasn't really working. And he had a miserable time making Trapped in Paradise. Like he just hated making that movie, and he became very disillusioned with selling, feeling like he was compromising his artistry in order to make these shitty Hollywood comedies. And that's when he read the script for Leaving Las Vegas, and he connected so deeply with Leaving Las Vegas that became his. Cage was always trying to distance himself from what he had just done. He was always trying to do the opposite of whatever his last movie was. And Leaving Las Vegas was kind of like the opposite of It Could Happen to You. Like it's such a dark and troubled and uncompromising film. And so that became another like redemptive moment in his career when he gave such a remarkable and emotionally charged performance in Leaving Las Vegas.
Yeah, so I want to talk so much about Leaving Las Vegas. Your book leads to Leaving Las Vegas. You were talking a little bit earlier how it's really kind of this almost halfway point in his career, or this turning point in his career in a lot of different ways. I've often thought about his career in terms of Leaving Las Vegas, but I want to save that for a second and talk about like the lead up to this. Was this a project he was searching for? Did this come to him? Like, did he know in the time what this film was going to do? We often talk about, like, you don't know what a movie's going to do for you. You don't know if it's going to do well at the box office, whatever. But, like, does he have a sense of what Leaving Las Vegas is going to be for him?
No, not at all. No, it was a low budget film. I believe the movie was made for about $3.5 million, which even then that was very little money to make a film with established movie stars like Nicolas Cage and Elizabeth Shue, and like no Hollywood studio was willing to finance this movie because of how dark it was. So the film got financing from some like small French small French studio, I believe, some French company, and Cage's agent sent him that script, and he read it, and he was so moved that he apparently started crying when he read the script, and he called up Mike Figgis, the director, or I think he sent him a fax, and he said, please don't let any other actors audition for this. I want to do it. I will make it work. I will do whatever I can to make it work. So he felt very connected to Leaving Las Vegas. He felt like he understood the character. But at the same time, Cage has talked about how he thought that the movie was so uncompromising that he wasn't sure it would even end up getting released. He definitely didn't think that he would win an Oscar for it. He thought it was going to be this low budget art film, which is kind of what Vampire's Kiss was. And Vampire's Kiss flopped at the box office and didn't make any money. And I think Cage thought that Leaving Las Vegas would be a similar story, and he didn't do it, because he thought it would be good for his career. He did it because he truly believed in that character and that performance.
Yeah, this is really, the anti helicopter film. This is the movie he's making, on a shoestring. And my God, Elizabeth Shue, as great as Cage is in this film, Shue is phenomenal.
Yeah, in
this movie.
And the movie was made. It was made for very little money. Cage agreed to defer half of his salary, so he wasn't being paid very much at all for the film, and the filmmakers couldn't get permits to shoot in Las Vegas because of how dark the script was. So they basically had to steal shots. It was like a guerrilla shoot. Like they just had to set up a very small film crew on the fly and steal shots before the cops would shut them down.
I've seen that film one time, Zach. It's like I don't need to go see Leaving Las Vegas ever again.
I've heard. Yeah, you're not the first person I've heard say that. But Cage Cage is remarkable in it, and I think part of what makes that movie work is that it's a very dark film. It's a very sad story.
Mm-hmm.
The character he's playing is doomed and has decided to drink himself to death. He's decided that he no longer has a future. But Cage brings this humor and levity to the performance. I mean, it's you wouldn't think of it as a comedy, but there are a lot of comical moments in Cage's performance in that film. And what I learned from interviewing Mike Figgis is that a lot of the funny, wacky lines that Cage does in the movie were basically his own ad libs, his own contributions to the script. They weren't in the script. They weren't in the book. The movie is based on a novel. Cage insisted on. Well, originally, he wanted to be drunk during the entire shoot. He approached Mike Figgis with this idea, like, I want to just be shit-faced drunk the entire shoot.
Do this method thing again.
Yeah, he wanted to do a full method performance, and he wanted to just be drinking nonstop, and he thought the movie would be more authentic if he was drunk off of his gourd during the entire shoot. And Mike Figgis said, absolutely not. Like, no fucking way. We need you to be on your game and awake and conscious.
Did you hit your marks?
Yeah. And so the compromise was that Cage decided to hire a drinking coach to hang out with him during the Leaving Las Vegas shoot. And the drinking coach was a poet and self-described drunk who was a family friend of the Coppolas. I think he had odd jobs on some of Francis's movies. A guy named Tony Dingman, who was a drunk poet who Cage hired to basically hang out in his trailer and get drunk all day. And Cage would simply observe this gentleman and try to assimilate Tony's mannerisms and things that came out of his mouth. And so there are lines in Leaving Las Vegas that came directly from things that Tony Dingman said while he was drinking in Cage's trailer. Like the scene when Cage is in this biker bar and he's hitting on this random woman and he says, "You do not kick the bar, you lean into the bar," something like that. And he's speaking in this like faux British accent. And that was something that he directly picked up from listening to Tony Dingman, drinking all day in his trailer. So Cage had a drinking coach. And when he won the Academy Award, one of the first people he thanked in his Academy Award acceptance speech was his drinking coach, Tony Dingman.
Okay, that's incredible. I had heard that he had gotten drunk for a couple of weeks beforehand just to get the sense. Okay, so he played around with the methodology.
He went on this trip to Ireland with his buddy, and they were in Ireland. They were getting drunk every night, and he had his friend videotape him while he was drunk so that he could watch the footage when he was sober and study his movements and his mannerisms while he was drunk.
Yeah, the idea now, I'm 46, and the idea that like when I have too much wine or anything like that, it's like, yeah, I'll go out and have a nice time. No, I do not. Like the idea of getting drunk ever again has no appeal to me whatsoever. Maybe if I were getting paid or I'm about to be in a film on this, but it's, God, no, absolutely not. All right, I want to talk to you. You talk about this film, your book leads to this movie for obvious reasons. As this benchmark in his career and things like that. He's got a 40-year career. He's got he's got another 30 years past where we're at now. Why is, aside from the Academy Award, is there a difference in Cage's life pre and post Leaving Las Vegas? Like, is there a change in his methodology? Is there a change in the way people see him?
Well,
what's different about him afterwards?
Winning the Oscar was a real moment of vindication for him. Because I think he had a chip on his shoulder because people didn't take him seriously. A lot of critics panned his performances in Peggy Sue Got Married and Vampire's Kiss, and he was kind of seen as this weirdo, wacky actor who went rogue and ruined movies and didn't take direction. He leaving Las Vegas was this real moment of vindication where he kind of proved to the industry that he was a real talent and he wasn't just a nepo baby coasting on his uncle's name. Not name, because he changed his name, but you know what I mean. But so he really kind of proved to the haters that he was here to stay when he won an Oscar. But one of the reasons why I chose to end the book with Leaving Las Vegas is because right after Leaving Las Vegas, he became an action, big blockbuster action movie star almost overnight. I mean, he had this action trilogy: The Rock, Con Air, Face Off, boom, like back to back. Those movies catapulted him into one of the biggest and highest paid stars in Hollywood. And they established him as this huge action movie hero. And all of a sudden he's, making $12 million, $20 million a movie. Shortly after that, he was cast as Superman in the Tim Burton Superman movie that sadly never got made. So his career entered a very different phase after leaving Las Vegas. He became this huge, big action movie star. He became very wealthy and started, bagging these huge paychecks for every movie he did. And he for a while it seemed like he was just going to keep getting bigger and bigger, and that he was going to be making $20 million a movie forever. That's not really how it happened, but the commercial peak of his career really began after he won an Oscar and started doing these big action movies.
Well, he's such an unlikely action star, and the fact that and The Rock plays off of this, right? He's kind of playing like the number two. He's not a macho character in The Rock. He's the unlikely guy. He's the guy, and he's Face Off is just nuts, and I keep waiting for a sequel on this. And then it makes him I think Snake Eyes is a really interesting film. I think did De Palma do that, if I recall correctly?
Yeah. Underrated.
And then 8mm, man. 8mm is a tough watch, but that's a gutsy choice.
Yeah. I like 8mm.
So do I. It's a good movie.
Yeah, I think that one is underrated as well. So there's, even after he became an action movie star, he was still challenging people's perceptions of him, and he would still balance out these big mainstream action movies with quieter, artsier movies like 8mm and Bringing Out the Dead, which he did with Scorsese around this time, which is another kind of brooding, dark, complicated film that didn't find the audience that it deserved. But the way his life changed was that he became fabulously wealthy as a result of his action movie success. And this is where his spending and his lifestyle really spiraled out of control.
Yeah,
so
you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So after he started earning these huge paychecks and doing these huge action movies, he started buying castles and mansions all over Europe. He bought a private island. He bought this historic castle in Germany, and his spending was really, really out of control. I think there's definitely some sort of addictive behavior going on there. Not to be an armchair psychiatrist, but Cage, at the height of his success, he owned something like 12, 13, 14 very, very extravagant houses. And he was just buying all this crazy real estate. And around 2008, 2009, when the housing market crashed, that period that kind of coincided with the career downturn for Cage. He did some movies that really didn't do well. The Ghost Rider sequel, and Next, and the Sorcerer's Apprentice was panned by critics. So his career entered a very difficult stretch, and he was no longer, his movies weren't making as much money as they were, a few years earlier. And so he really started dealing with like serious financial problems. He just like fell into deep debt, owed millions of dollars to the IRS, and basically in order to dig himself out of this hole that he fell into, he needed to work nonstop throughout the 2010s decade. And this is why he entered this phase where he was no longer getting big roles. He was no longer working with the big studios. He was basically doing a lot of like straight to streaming, movies directed by no-name directors, a lot of like kind of faceless, mediocre trash films. And he was saying yes to everything that came his way because he needed the paycheck.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And he was near bankruptcy because of all this like real estate that he bought, and then he couldn't unload it when he needed to.
Yeah, I'm looking, I've got this print out in front of me. 2011, he does Season of the Witch, Drive Angry, Seeking Justice, Trespass, a Ghost Rider sequel, followed by
so I think
Words.
All of the movies you just named were flops and panned by critics.
Absolutely.
And so his career took a dive. His finances were in deep trouble. He was in over his head financially. He was no longer getting paid the kinds of big paychecks that he was, in the late 90s, early 2000s. And his critical standing really plummeted. I mean, movies like Trespass and Drive Angry were ridiculed by critics. And this is the period where Cage kind of became a punchline, and he was being mocked and ridiculed by a lot of the media.
Zach, the man made a Left Behind remake. If that's not, rock bottom, I don't know. All of this stuff is so bad. And then he pops back up, years later. And he shows back up in 2018 doing Spider-Man Noir in the Spider-Man, in the Spider-Verse. And it's like, people are like, oh my God, I still love this guy. After making all of this schlock, it's almost like people are okay with waiting him out to come back to something.
I think his comeback really got started with Mandy.
Good
kind of a psychedelic revenge horror film, which came out, interestingly, that came out in 2018, right around the time that I hatched the idea for this book. Although when I started the book, I wrote the proposal in 2019. I signed the book deal in 2020. And at that time, he was still kind of struggling. His career was still in a bad place. And I did not anticipate that he would have the career revival that he has had. By the time my book came out in the fall of last year, he had done Pig, he had done Dream Scenario, and he had really entered this kind of Cage-assance, if you will, and he had restored his critical standing. He was nominated for a Golden Globe recently for Dream Scenario. He's really crawled back out of the gutter.
If you pop on Netflix right now, The Flash is on Netflix, and they've got his picture.
Yeah.
On the screen on Netflix doing the Superman thing.
That is pretty misleading advertising, because he's only in he's in The Flash for one scene, and it's like I think it's like partially AI generated. Yeah, at the same time, they're purposely choosing Nick Cage to sell this film, right? With Michael Keaton back as Batman. All right, I want to ask you here, because you actually lead off the book, not with Nick Cage, but you're actually talking to Ethan Hawke in this film. Yeah.
In the book, excuse me, right? Which really turned my head, because I love Hawke. I'm late Gen X, so I grew up on Hawke. The Before Midnight series is like, it's a perfect trilogy. And Hawke is talking about how much he admires Cage. What's the general, do you get a sense when you talked to all these people around Cage? Because you said Cage declined to be in the book, which kills me because I love the way you write.
Mm-hmm.
But do you get a sense of how he's viewed in Hollywood or by his peers at all?
Ethan Hawke is a huge admirer of Cage. And the reason I interviewed Ethan Hawke for a Newsweek article back in 2018, and the reason that I brought Cage up when I was interviewing Ethan Hawke is because Ethan Hawke had made this comment in a Reddit AMA where he said that Nicolas Cage something like Nicolas Cage is the only actor since Marlon Brando who's done anything new with the form of acting, and I thought that was really fascinating. And so Ethan Hawke is is a huge admirer of Cage, obviously. I think the thing about Cage is that he's been in so many movies that he's kind of worked with everyone. It's like you can't throw a rock in Hollywood without hitting someone who's co-starred with Nicolas Cage at this point. And he people love working with Cage because he's very focused. He's very intense. He takes every role very seriously. And he can certainly be kind of wacky and eccentric to work with, but not in like a diva, spoiled Hollywood brat kind of way, more in like this guy is so committed to the performance that he's like trying to stay in character, and he's, fighting with the producer because he thinks that they should have a real live bat attacking him in this scene, which he did in Vampire's Kiss. But I think actors tend to view Nicolas Cage as an enigma. He's kind of in a category of one. And I think for the most part, actors have a tremendous amount of respect for him because of his 40-year career, and because of the range and the versatility of his filmography, which I think is something that's quite rare in Hollywood. Ethan Hawke certainly is in awe of him, and a lot of the actors who I interviewed for the book, people who've worked with him, like Matthew Modine and Bridget Fonda, and I interviewed the late James Caan in one of his last interviews before he passed. All of these people spoke very highly of Cage and had deep admiration and respect for him.
I have to ask you, based on the fact that you're on this pod right now, why don't we have a National Treasure 3?
That I don't know.
The films did well.
Yeah. I don't know. There was a lot of talk about it happening, and then it didn't happen. It was in development hell for a while, and I don't really know what happened there.
I mean, the joke I make is like, it's not like he was going to turn down the script. And it's amazing to me in an era in which we see sequels and IP and all this kind of stuff, that these would be like a given. People really enjoy that series. All right, I wanted to ask you about this, and I want to get in. We'll get into your 5 films here in a bit about that talk about Cage's career that you think. But how do you write a book like this, Zach? When you're like, how do you write a book about a man who's still alive, right, and create these sources and things like that? And how do you seek out these interviews and things? Like, what's the creation like this for you? Because you said you signed it, you pitched it in 19, was it?
Yeah.
And this is a pretty quick turnaround. How do you write this book? Like, what goes into something like this? Did you have to watch every single film in his catalog? What did you do?
I didn't watch every single film in his catalog, but I certainly did watch every film that he did in the 80s and 90s, the period of his career that I was focusing on. I spent a lot of time watching his movies, but more importantly, I spent a lot of time interviewing people. So there are some other books about Nicolas Cage that are out there that are more like critical overviews of his career, more from a critic's perspective of analyzing his movies, analyzing his performances. But there's never been like a proper, well-researched, well-reported biography of Cage that's rooted in original reporting. And that is what I wanted to achieve with this book. I knew that in order to write a book that was worth people's time, I needed to do a lot of interviews with anyone who worked with Cage, who had stories to share about him. And the thing about Cage is that he's such an eccentric such an intense, like, wacky force. Everyone who's worked with him on a movie has an interesting story. Everyone has like a story of how intense or memorable he was to work with. Like, you're not like, no one is like, oh yeah, like I worked with Nicolas Cage, like, yeah, didn't make much of an impression.
Fine.
No one is like
Hey.
that. Everyone is like, oh my god, like I remember that he was filming a sex scene with Jennifer Beals, and he demanded that the crew have hot yogurt poured on his feet during the filming of the sex scene. Stories like that, crazy shit. You know, he insisted on wearing his bandages in the movie Birdie. He insisted on wearing those bandages 24/7 during, like, for 4 weeks during that shoot, and it drove the makeup artist crazy. Stories about how far he committed to every performance, and the method acting and the eccentricity and the intensity. I really wanted to tap into those kinds of stories. And I wanted to unearth stories that have not been told previously, things that you wouldn't be able to find just from like scanning his Wikipedia page. So I started the book in 2020. We were, this was the lockdown era. This was the early COVID era. And I was quarantining. Everyone was quarantining. Hollywood was kind of shut down during that period. And I think perhaps I was able to use the pandemic to my advantage because a lot of people in Hollywood had a lot of time on their hands. They weren't working. And so I was emailing a lot of directors, producers, casting agents, first ADs, second ADs. I was just going through IMDb cast and crew credits, finding people who had worked with Cage on his formative films, cold emailing them, asking if they were willing to grant me an interview. And these people had a lot of time on their hands because they were, trapped in quarantine. And so I did a lot of the interviews for this book I did in 2020, 2021, during the early COVID era. I was able to get some big name interview subjects to talk to me, like David Lynch, I interviewed for the book, Amy Heckerling, who directed Fast Times at Ridgemont High, James Caan, who I mentioned, I interviewed about Honeymoon in Vegas. I was talking to anyone who I could, and a lot of the most like interesting and compelling interviews that I did were with people who are not famous or well known, just like casting agents. Like the Coen brothers' early casting agent had incredible anecdotes about what it was like to work with the Coen brothers on Raising Arizona, and this whole saga of how the role was between Cage and Kevin Costner, and
Lord.
yeah, and Cage really went to bat for the role in Raising Arizona, and he had to fly to New York to meet with the Coen brothers at their office, and the Coen brothers weren't sure about him, and they weren't sure if he could play this wacky, desert character. That casting agent had incredible stories, and people who worked with Cage behind the scenes on Valley Girl and Birdie, people who are not well known. Like, these people had incredible stories to tell about what it was like to work with 19-year-old Nicolas Cage before he was really famous. And so I wanted the book to be rooted in that kind of original reporting. I felt like, I guess I kind of had a bit of a chip on my shoulder because I felt like there are these other books about Nicolas Cage that are out there, including a book that Keith Phipps, formerly of the AV Club, was writing at the same time that I was writing my book. And I felt like I really needed to do a lot of original research and a lot of original reporting in order to make my book worthwhile. I felt really desperate to prove that I was worthy of writing a book about Nicolas Cage. And so I did more than 100 interviews, and I talked to some of Cage's high school friends who were in acting classes with him at Beverly Hills High. The thing is, a lot of people who went to high school with Cage have gone on to notable careers in the entertainment industry. I mean, Crispin Glover was Cage's high school classmate. The David Cohan, the creator of Will and Grace, was Cage's high school classmate. I believe Lenny Kravitz went to high school with Nicolas Cage. I didn't talk to him for the book, but a lot of people who attended Beverly Hills High in the early '80s have gone on to big notable careers in the entertainment industry, and some of those people I was able to speak with and hear their anecdotes of what Cage was like in high school. The thing about Cage is that the eccentricity was there long before he was famous. I mean, it's not just an act. He really was a force of nature even when he was, sitting in acting class in Beverly Hills High. I also spent a lot of time reading old newspaper articles, interviews, profiles, magazine profiles of Nicolas Cage. I visited the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, and they had this whole, like a literal manila envelope stacked with old press clippings about Nicolas Cage. And a lot of this material cannot be found on the internet. Like, magazines are terrible at preserving their archives. So I would just sit in the library, thumbing through these old newspaper and magazine clippings and finding interesting interview nuggets and historical snippets about Cage's career, stories that are not available on the internet. And it was very old school, the way that I approached this research.
Were there people when you reached out? Were people ever hesitant? Is there a rule inside, like, don't say negative things? I'm just kind of wondering, as far as, like, is there a protective nature to these times of relationships?
The thing is that when I reached out to Hollywood publicists and like assistants and PR assistants, and those people were very nervous to cooperate with me because their first question was, is Cage participating in the book? And I didn't want to lie to them. So I would say, like, so far, no, but I'm trying to reach out to Cage. I want him to participate. The book is certainly not making him look. The book is written from a place of admiration. It's not a hatchet job. But a lot, I was reaching out to big movie stars. I would reach out to their publicity teams, like reaching out to Sean Penn and reaching out to Sarah Jessica Parker. And I had trouble getting these A-listers to talk to me. And I think in a lot of cases, the PR people were not even forwarding my request to the talent because they didn't want to cooperate with me if the book wasn't authorized by Nicolas Cage. And that was a challenge. And I found that in order to get sources to talk to me, I kind of needed to, whenever I could, I would try to bypass the PR team and I would try to interview the talent directly. I mean, or I would just, like, reach out to their personal manager. Who managers were for whatever reason, managers were a little more willing to cooperate. But I had to, like, email Mike Figgis directly, the director of Leaving Las Vegas, to get him to talk to me, and he was willing to talk to me after I made an appeal to him over email directly. And I told him I've interviewed all these other people. I've interviewed the cinematographer of Leaving Las Vegas and the first AD. I kind of, like, showed him that I was serious. Yeah. Who, and I had to email, what's his name? Andrew Bergman, the director of Honeymoon in Vegas and It Could Happen to You. I kind of had to, like, email him directly to get him to talk to me. I was trying to, like, bypass the gatekeepers a little bit and try to, like, make my appeal directly to the person I wanted to talk to. At one point, I, like, was desperately trying to talk to Crispin Glover, who went to high school with Cage. And Crispin Glover is really off the map. I don't think he even has a PR person. I don't think he doesn't really use the internet at all. I found a PO box for Crispin Glover online, and I wrote him a letter, and I mailed a letter to his P.O. box, and I was eagerly waiting for a response. And a few weeks later, the letter was returned to sender. Turns out it's no longer his P.O. box. So I was never able to get in touch with Crispin Glover, which was disappointing.
Yeah, he'd be an interesting story. But, I just want him for the Hot Tub Time Machine episode we'll do at some point in time.
Yeah.
All right, I want to ask you. We're kind of coming to a close here, but I'm kind of, as we're working our way towards an end. Are there 5 movies, Zach? You've spent all this time getting to know Cage by talking to all these people. You spent all this time watching these films, thinking about his work, his relevance, things like that. Are there 5 movies? And this is an arbitrary number here, but that you really kind of say, this is the Nick Cage I want you to know.
Raising Arizona, Vampire's Kiss, Moonstruck, Leaving Las Vegas, and Face Off. I feel like those 5 movies capture a lot of different sides of him and show his range and his versatility and also his intensity as an actor. But I feel guilty because I haven't picked any movies from, after the year 2000. And I feel like I need to pick something from the later years of his career.
Are there stuff from his later years that you like?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I think Matchstick Men is an incredible performance, and that movie doesn't get talked about as much as it deserves. It's probably the best cinematic portrayal of obsessive compulsive disorder I've ever seen, and I think he's really captivating in Matchstick Men. In terms of his more recent work, I think Pig was a really moving, really powerful performance. And Pig was a movie that really, I think it proved to people that Cage still has, he still has it. Yeah. He still has new things to show us. And he there's kind of this thematic overtone in Pig where the character that he's playing is down on his luck and kind of in the wilderness. And I think Cage's career was in the wilderness at that time. And there's a parallel to be drawn. And it's a really emotional, powerful performance in Pig. And I think that I think Pig is the best work that he's done in well over a decade. And if you look at some of Cage's recent interviews, he in the past, he's said that Vampire's Kiss is his favorite movie he's ever done. But over the past couple years, when people ask him, what's your favorite movie he's ever done? He started saying that Pig is his favorite movie he's ever done, which I think is really interesting. Maybe there's some recency bias happening, but it shows that Pig clearly means a lot to him.
Yeah, it's a film that if people haven't seen, it's absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah.
I have a guilty pleasure Nick Cage film.
Oh yeah?
It's Family Man.
That is the first Nicolas Cage movie I ever saw. Even before National Treasure. I remember renting Family Man from Blockbuster when I was probably 10 or 11 years old. It's the first movie of his I ever saw. And I wouldn't say it's a good movie, but it's touching. It's it
works. It's a fun movie to watch. Yeah, Don Cheadle's great. Him and John Cheadle going back and forth.
It's one of those it's one of those super 90s, early 2000s movies where a character wakes up in an alternate reality and they have to navigate this fish out of water type of situation. I think he's good at channeling that discomfort.
Yeah, well, again, in these films, kind of like Face Off, where he's playing really 2 different characters in that film. Right? Yeah, where he starts as one and does the transition. His chemistry with Taylor Leone, I think, is really, really good in that film as well. I just like the movie. So
I'm pretty sure The Family Man was the first Nicolas Cage movie I ever saw, and National Treasure was probably the second one I saw.
Yeah, well, National Treasure's become the most important film that I've ever seen of his, as far as cultural relevance to me.
And it was after National Treasure after National Treasure, I started working my way backwards. When I was in high school, I watched Raising Arizona and Peggy Sue Got Married, and that's when I really got sucked into his whole filmography.
Yeah, it's, the thing is, like you were saying earlier, it doesn't seem like he's going to slow down either, because we've got Long Legs, which is just, there's a lot of buzz about this film right now.
Yeah.
At some point in time, you're probably going to have to write the sequel to this and come back and revisit this and revisit his work. You've got like another 30, 40 years of work to talk about here. So
I think people have asked me if I'm going to write a sequel, and I think I would only do it if he agreed to cooperate this time. Because it was challenging to write a book without his participation. That was a challenge. I felt like I had to kind of I felt like I had to write around his participation, and I was very worried that he would try to sabotage me or try to stop people from cooperating with the book. He didn't. It never came to that. But I was worried that if he didn't like the idea of me writing this book, he might try to block the book in some way.
Sure.
And he didn't, thankfully, but it was a real concern of mine, writing this unauthorized biography.
Well, if it makes you feel any better or anything like that, I actually dug that he's not in this book. I mean, obviously, if you had a chance to kind of sit down and get behind us and get his own thoughts and stuff like that, but the fact that you had to kind of construct this narrative around him, I thought it was great, man. I really dug it.
Thank you.
No, this is good stuff. Which leads me to my question here: what's next on the? Are you working on other projects? Are you starting to? Are other ideas germinating right now, or like what's next for you?
I want to write more books, and I want to write more books about movies, and I don't know what the next book is going to be, but have some ideas that I'm mulling over. I'm still trying to figure that out. I'm back in the freelancing grind. So I've been back to writing regularly for my regular outlets, which are usually Pitchfork, Spin, Vulture, The Guardian. I'm back to freelancing full time, and I'm trying to figure out what the next book is going to be.
Well, brother, listen, if anytime you want to come back on and like riff on any film that you want to talk about, the invitation is open, and I hope you'll accept it, because this has been a blast talking to you about this dude and your work and constructing this book, which is so freaking cool. I thank you.
My pleasure.
For sitting down with me.
My pleasure.
It's been a blast.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you, of course, to our guest today, Zach Schonfeld. Zach, thank you so very much for being here and being part of the HATM community. Thank you, of course, to Fletcher Powell for making this show possible. And, of course, thank you to you guys for continuing to make HATM possible, for sharing these podcasts with your friends, posting them on social media, and leaving comments, good ones, on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you'd like to continue to help HATM grow, the best thing we can do, we need your money. So visit patreon.com/historians at the movies. Pledge your support there. We'll give you some swag, some shout outs here on the pod, and we'll keep producing stuff for you. That said, this was a lot of fun, guys. Ciao for now.